In May 1975, as the United States was still reeling from the collapse of South Vietnam and the abrupt end of its long war in Indochina, a seemingly minor maritime incident in the Gulf of Thailand escalated into the last major armed clash of the Vietnam War era, revealing how unresolved trauma, damaged credibility, and Cold War reflexes could converge to produce sudden violence even after a superpower believed a conflict had ended. Because the seizure of the American container ship SS Mayagüez by Cambodian forces was not merely a dispute over maritime boundaries, but a test of American resolve at a moment when U.S. power appeared wounded and uncertain. And this made the incident far more dangerous than its immediate circumstances suggested, as it unfolded in a region where revolutionary regimes were consolidating power and where the symbolism of American weakness carried enormous weight. And the roots of the crisis lay in the chaotic geopolitical environment of Southeast Asia in early 1975, when the communist victories in Vietnam and Laos had rapidly altered the balance of power and left Washington scrambling to redefine its role in a region it no longer dominated. And in Cambodia, this transformation had been especially violent, because the seizure of Phnom Penh by the Khmer Rouge in April 1975 brought to power a radical revolutionary movement that rejected diplomacy, embraced extreme isolation, and viewed the outside world through a lens of suspicion and hostility, shaped by years of civil war and foreign bombing. And this new regime, barely weeks old, was determined to assert its sovereignty aggressively, particularly against the United States, which it blamed for Cambodia's devastation. And it was within this volatile atmosphere that the Mayagüez, an unarmed American merchant vessel traveling from Hong Kong to Thailand, entered waters near the Cambodian coast, waters whose legal status was disputed and whose control the new Cambodian leadership sought to enforce as a demonstration of revolutionary authority. And on May 12, 1975, Khmer Rouge patrol boats intercepted the ship, boarded it, and forced it toward the island of Koh Tang, taking its American crew captive and cutting off direct communication with Washington. And although the seizure did not initially involve violence against the crew, the symbolism of an American vessel captured by a revolutionary communist regime so soon after the fall of Saigon struck at the core of American anxieties about decline, humiliation, and the erosion of deterrence, because it occurred at a moment when the United States was intensely sensitive to any further signs that its authority could be challenged without consequence. And this sensitivity shaped the response of the administration of Gerald Ford, which had inherited the aftermath of Vietnam, and was determined to demonstrate that the United States remained capable of decisive action. And within hours of learning of the seizure, senior officials framed the incident not as a maritime misunderstanding to be resolved quietly, but as a direct challenge to American credibility, a framing that reflected the Cold War belief that restraint in one context could invite aggression elsewhere. And this belief was amplified by the absence of reliable intelligence about the intentions of the Khmer Rouge, whose secrecy and extremism made them appear unpredictable and potentially dangerous, raising fears that delay or negotiation might result in harm to the crew or encourage further provocations. And as a result, Washington moved rapidly toward a military response, mobilizing naval and air forces in the region and authorizing contingency plans that included the use of force to recover both the ship and its crew, even though the precise location of the captives and the intentions of their captors remained unclear. And this uncertainty was compounded by the broader Cold War context, because the seizure was interpreted through the lens of recent defeat in Vietnam, with policymakers acutely aware that domestic and international audiences were watching to see whether the United States would act decisively or retreat again, and this awareness created intense pressure to respond quickly, favoring action over caution. And as American forces converged on the Gulf of Thailand, diplomatic channels were limited and unreliable, because the Khmer Rouge had virtually no established mechanisms for communication with Washington and little interest in negotiation. And this lack of communication reinforced the perception that only force could resolve the crisis, leading to decisions that prioritized speed and symbolism over clarity and coordination. And in this sense, the Mayagüez Incident became less about the ship itself and more about the unresolved psychological and strategic aftermath of the Vietnam War, a moment when the United States sought to reassert control over events to counter the narrative of defeat. And this reassertion took place in an environment where miscalculation was likely because the region was saturated with recent violence, revolutionary fervor, and mistrust, and where American military assets were still deployed under assumptions shaped by a war that had just ended without victory. And as orders were issued and forces prepared for action, the stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal how the Cold War's logic of credibility and deterrence could override careful assessment, turning a limited maritime seizure into a deadly military operation whose consequences would extend far beyond the immediate recovery of a single ship. As the American response accelerated, the Mayagüez Incident moved from diplomatic crisis to military operation with remarkable speed, because within hours of the seizure, Washington had concluded that delay would signal weakness and that visible force was necessary to restore credibility, a conclusion shaped as much by emotion and symbolism as by strategic calculation. And this sense of urgency drove a series of decisions made under severe informational constraints as U.S. officials struggled to determine where the crew was being held, what the Khmer Rouge intended to do with them, and how far the new Cambodian regime was willing to go in defying American power. And in the absence of clear intelligence, worst-case assumptions quickly filled the gaps, creating a bias toward immediate action. And this bias was reinforced by the domestic political context, because the administration faced a Congress and a public deeply skeptical of foreign military engagement, yet simultaneously sensitive to further humiliation after Vietnam, producing a narrow window in which decisive action could be justified as defensive rather than imperial. And within this window, the Pentagon assembled a task force drawn from assets still operating in the region after the evacuation of Saigon, including naval vessels, marine units, and tactical aircraft, creating an 18-chinsti improvised response whose speed came at the expense of coordination. And one of the central decisions was to retake the Mayagüez itself, an operation that was launched before confirmation that the crew remained aboard, reflecting the assumption that control of the ship was inseparable from control of the hostages. And in parallel, planners identified Koh Tang as the likely holding site for the crew, based on fragmentary intelligence and the movement of the ship toward the island. And this assumption would prove pivotal because it shaped the choice to conduct a helicopter-borne assault on Koh Tang, despite limited reconnaissance and uncertainty about enemy strength. And as American aircraft began striking Cambodian patrol boats and coastal facilities to demonstrate resolve and limit Khmer Rouge mobility, the operation escalated further, blurring the line between hostage rescue and punitive strike. And this escalation was driven in part by the belief that overwhelming force would compel compliance, a belief rooted in Cold War deterrence theory, but poorly suited to a regime like the Khmer Rouge, whose revolutionary ideology and internal dynamics did not conform to conventional models of coercion. And as the operation unfolded, communication failures compounded the risk, because information about the crew's status moved slowly and inconsistently through command channels, leaving field commanders to act on outdated or incomplete guidance. And this fog of war was intensified by the novelty of the adversary, as American planners had little understanding of Khmer Rouge command structures or decision-making processes, making it difficult to predict how they would respond to U.S. actions. And on the ground at Koh Tang, these uncertainties translated into deadly consequences, because the Marines inserted onto the island encountered unexpectedly heavy resistance from well-armed Cambodian forces, revealing that the island was not a lightly defended holding area but a significant military position, and this miscalculation turned what was intended as a rapid rescue into a prolonged and chaotic firefight, with helicopters shot down, units pinned under fire, and casualties mounting rapidly. And as the battle intensified, American commanders faced the grim realization that the operation was unfolding largely blind, with no confirmation that the hostages were even present on the island, raising the possibility that lives were being lost in an assault disconnected from the mission's core objective. And this realization highlighted the central paradox of the Mayagüez Incident, that in the rush to demonstrate resolve and erase the stigma of Vietnam, the United States had committed itself to a military action whose tactical risks were high and whose strategic necessity was increasingly uncertain. And even as fighting continued, events were already moving toward an ironic conclusion, because unbeknownst to American forces at the time, the Khmer Rouge had begun releasing the crew, a decision influenced less by U.S. firepower than by internal calculations, and the desire to avoid entanglement with a distant superpower. And this disconnect between battlefield reality and political outcome would soon expose how narrowly the incident balanced between symbolic success and operational failure, revealing how Cold War instincts could drive lethal action even as the original crisis was already resolving itself through other means. As the fighting on Koh Tang intensified, the Mayagüez operation revealed how quickly Cold War crisis logic could detach military action from political reality. Because while American forces were engaged in a fierce battle against entrenched Khmer Rouge units, the central objective of rescuing the crew was already slipping out of alignment with events beyond the battlefield. And this misalignment was the product of cascading assumptions made under pressure, as early intelligence failures hardened into operational commitments that were difficult to reverse once lives were at stake. And on Koh Tang, the Marines faced a determined defense that contradicted pre-assault expectations, encountering heavy machine gun fire, mortars, and coordinated resistance that suggested the island had been prepared for combat rather than used merely as a temporary holding site. And this resistance inflicted immediate losses, with multiple helicopters shot down during insertion attempts, leaving some units isolated and forcing commanders to improvise under fire. And the intensity of the engagement underscored how the operation had shifted from a rescue mission into a conventional battle against a force whose strength had been underestimated. And as casualties mounted, the imperative to extract the Marines safely became as urgent as the original goal of recovering the hostages, complicating decision-making and narrowing options. And throughout this chaos, communication gaps persisted because reports that the crew had been moved off Koh Tang and placed aboard a fishing vessel were delayed and contested, preventing a timely reassessment of the assault. And this delay illustrates how bureaucratic friction and the fog of war can sustain combat long after its strategic rationale has evaporated. And at the political level, the administration remained committed to the operation's momentum, because reversing course mid-action risked appearing indecisive and would have raised questions about why force had been used in the first place, reinforcing a tendency to press forward even as uncertainty grew. And this tendency reflected the deeper Cold War belief that resolve must be demonstrated through action, even when action no longer served its original purpose. and as American aircraft continued to strike Cambodian targets on the mainland and at sea, the scope of the incident expanded further, increasing the risk of unintended escalation, with a regime whose internal dynamics were opaque and whose reaction to sustained attack was unpredictable. And yet for the Khmer Rouge, the calculus was different, because their decision to release the crew was shaped less by American military pressure than by a desire to avoid entanglement with a powerful external actor at a moment when they were consolidating control internally. And this divergence in perception meant that while Washington interpreted force as decisive, Phnom Penh viewed disengagement as expedient, creating a situation in which violence continued, even as the political dispute that triggered it was effectively ending. And when confirmation finally reached American commanders that the crew had been freed and was en route to safety, the news arrived against the backdrop of ongoing combat on Koh Tang, producing a stark contrast between symbolic victory and tactical cost, because the mission could now be declared a success even as Marines remained under fire and casualties continued to accrue. And this contrast exposed the underlying tragedy of the incident, that lives were lost not to secure the release of hostages, but to satisfy an imperative of credibility shaped by the psychological aftermath of Vietnam. And as evacuation efforts began under fire, the operation entered its final, most dangerous phase, as extracting forces from hostile terrain under combat conditions required additional risks, further illustrating how an initial decision to act quickly had generated a chain of consequences that could not be neatly contained. And in this sense, the Mayagüez incident stands as a cautionary example of how Cold War reflexes could convert uncertainty into violence, demonstrating that the desire to prove resolve, once set in motion, could sustain combat even after the original crisis had already begun to resolve itself by other means. As the evacuation from Koh Tang unfolded, the operation reached its most perilous moment, because extracting Marines under sustained fire required precise coordination in an environment already defined by confusion, damage, and loss. And this phase of the battle underscored how the logic of escalation, once triggered, rarely allows for clean conclusions, as each attempt to disengage introduced new risks that compounded the original miscalculations. And on the island, American forces struggled to regroup amid heavy resistance, with helicopters returning repeatedly into hostile fire zones to retrieve isolated units, a process that exposed air crews and ground forces alike to continued danger. And this danger persisted even as the strategic justification for the assault had evaporated, because confirmation of the crew's release meant the original objective had been achieved independently of the fighting, transforming the mission into a race to minimize further casualties rather than to accomplish a political goal. And this transformation revealed the grim asymmetry between symbolic success and human cost. Because while Washington could soon declare victory, those on the ground faced the immediate reality of survival under fire. And as extraction continued, the operation's improvisational nature became apparent, with commanders forced to make rapid decisions about which units to pull out first and how to balance speed against safety, highlighting the consequences of launching an assault without full situational awareness. And the loss of helicopters earlier in the engagement further constrained options, reducing lift capacity and forcing repeated sorties into contested airspace, each one carrying the risk of additional losses. And as the final Marines were lifted from the island, the battle left behind a stark tally: dozens of American casualties, including several killed in action, suffered in an operation whose necessity was now openly questioned within military and political circles, and this questioning extended beyond the battlefield to the broader meaning of the incident, because the Mayagüez operation had been framed publicly as a decisive response that restored American credibility after Vietnam. Yet The details of the engagement revealed a more ambiguous reality, one in which force had been applied rapidly and visibly, but without clear understanding of its target or timing. And this ambiguity complicated the narrative of success, because while the crew's safe return allowed the administration to claim a favorable outcome, the casualties and confusion undermined the notion that the incident represented a clean break from the errors of the recent past. And instead, it suggested continuity as patterns of haste, intelligence gaps, and symbolic decision-making persisted even after the formal end of the Vietnam War. And this continuity mattered because it exposed how deeply the Cold War's logic of credibility and deterrence was embedded in American strategic culture, shaping responses even when circumstances called for restraint or patience. And in the aftermath of the incident, debates emerged within the United States about the use of force, the chain of command, and the role of Congress in authorizing military action, debates that reflected lingering unease about executive power and the lessons of Vietnam. And these debates highlighted the tension between the desire to demonstrate resolve and the imperative to avoid unnecessary loss of life. A tension that had defined much of the Cold War and would continue to shape American interventions in the years to come. And internationally, the incident sent mixed signals, because while it showed that the United States was willing to use force quickly to protect its interests, it also revealed the limits of that force when applied without clear intelligence or strategic alignment. And for the Khmer Rouge, the episode reinforced their isolation and hostility toward the outside world, confirming their perception that foreign powers were willing to use violence without regard for Cambodian sovereignty, even as it validated their decision to avoid prolonged confrontation with a distant superpower. And in this sense, the Mayagüez Incident encapsulated a transitional moment, one in which the United States sought to reassert authority after defeat, yet did so using instincts forged in a war that had just ended, producing an outcome that was simultaneously a political victory and a tactical warning. And as the last helicopters departed Koh Tang and the smoke cleared, the incident left behind a complex legacy, demonstrating how quickly Cold War reflexes could convert uncertainty into bloodshed, and how the desire to restore credibility could override caution even when the original crisis was already dissolving, offering a sobering reminder that the end of a war does not automatically end the habits of thought that war creates. In the immediate aftermath of the Mayagüez incident, the United States moved quickly to frame the operation as a success, emphasizing the recovery of the ship and the safe return of its crew as proof that American resolve had survived the trauma of Vietnam. And this framing mattered because it was aimed as much at domestic reassurance as at international signaling, presenting decisive action as evidence that the era of retreat had ended. Yet beneath this narrative, the details of the operation told a far more uneasy story, one in which force had been applied rapidly but imprecisely, and in which lives were lost during a mission whose central objective had already been achieved through non-military means. And this discrepancy exposed a fundamental tension between political messaging and operational reality, because, while the administration could point to a visible outcome, the cost paid on Koh Tang raised questions about whether the incident represented restored credibility or merely the continuation of flawed habits formed during the Vietnam War. And these questions resonated within the military itself, where after-action assessments highlighted failures in intelligence, coordination, and command structure, noting that assumptions about enemy strength and hostage location had driven decisions that proved costly once confronted by reality. And these critiques underscored how the rush to act had narrowed the space for deliberation, reinforcing a Cold War pattern in which speed and symbolism were prioritized over clarity and restraint. And at the political level, the incident reignited debates over executive authority and the use of force, because the operation had been conducted without congressional authorization at a moment when the war powers resolution was still new and untested, raising concerns that the lessons of Vietnam regarding unchecked presidential power were already being set aside in the name of credibility. And this concern reflected a broader unease about how quickly the United States might return to reflexive military responses, despite widespread public skepticism toward foreign intervention. And internationally, the Mayagüez incident produced ambiguous signals because, while some allies viewed the operation as a necessary assertion of strength, others saw it as evidence that American decision-making remained volatile in the aftermath of defeat, capable of sudden escalation based on incomplete information. And for adversaries, the message was equally mixed, suggesting both willingness to act and vulnerability to miscalculation. And for Cambodia, the incident deepened isolation, confirming the Khmer Rouge's hostility toward the outside world and reinforcing their turn inward, even as it validated their belief that limited confrontation could be survived so long as it did not invite prolonged engagement. And in this way, the episode reinforced a pattern in which revolutionary regimes tested boundaries through provocation while avoiding sustained conflict. And for the families of those killed or wounded, the political narratives offered little comfort because the losses suffered on Koh Tang were difficult to reconcile with the claim of victory, highlighting the human cost of decisions driven by symbolism rather than necessity. And this human cost lingered as a quiet counterpoint to official declarations, reminding observers that the Cold War's logic of credibility often imposed its heaviest burdens on those closest to the fighting. And as analysts and historians later revisited the Mayagüez incident, it came to be seen not as a simple epilogue to Vietnam, but as a bridge between eras, revealing how the psychological and strategic legacies of a long war could persist beyond its formal end, shaping responses to new crises in ways that reproduced old risks. And in this sense, the incident serves as a cautionary example of how easily the Cold War's habits of thought could outlive the conflicts that created them, turning a limited maritime seizure into a lethal military operation whose meaning remains contested, suspended between the desire to declare closure and the reality that the patterns of escalation and misjudgment had not yet been left behind. As time passed and the immediacy of the crisis faded, the Mayagüez incident took on greater significance as historians and policymakers began to situate it within the broader arc of Cold War behavior, recognizing it as a moment when the United States, emerging from the psychological shock of Vietnam, reflexively reverted to patterns of action shaped by decades of confrontation, rather than adapting to a changed strategic environment. And this recognition mattered because it revealed how deeply embedded the logic of credibility and deterrence had become in American decision-making, to the point where even a limited maritime seizure by a weak and isolated regime could trigger a full-scale military response. And this response was driven less by an assessment of proportional necessity than by the fear that inaction would signal irreversible decline. And within this framework, the incident exposed a lingering inability to distinguish between symbolic challenges and existential threats, a difficulty that had plagued Cold War policy throughout its duration. And for the military, the episode reinforced painful lessons about the dangers of acting on incomplete intelligence, because the failure to accurately locate the hostages or assess enemy strength transformed a rescue mission into a costly firefight, highlighting how speed without clarity can magnify risk rather than reduce it. And these lessons fed into subsequent reforms in joint operations and crisis response, even as the underlying impulse to act decisively remained largely intact, And politically, the incident underscored the fragility of post-Vietnam restraint, demonstrating how quickly executive authority could reassert itself in moments of perceived challenge, despite legislative efforts to impose limits. And this fragility suggested that the Vietnam experience had not fundamentally altered the balance between caution and action, but had merely complicated it, creating a persistent tension that would re-emerge in later interventions. And internationally, the Mayagüez Incident contributed to a recalibration of perceptions, because while it showed that the United States was willing to use force abruptly, it also revealed that such force could be applied hastily and at high cost, complicating the image of restored confidence that the administration sought to project. And for revolutionary regimes observing the episode, the lesson was nuanced, suggesting that provocation could elicit a strong response, yet also that disengagement and ambiguity could limit escalation, reinforcing a pattern in which symbolic defiance was balanced against pragmatic avoidance of prolonged confrontation. And for Cambodia, the incident became part of a narrative of siege and hostility that justified further isolation, reinforcing the Khmer Rouge's inward turn and their rejection of external norms, even as it underscored the dangers of miscalculation in dealing with a wounded superpower. And from a broader Cold War perspective, the Mayagüez incident illustrates how the end of one conflict does not immediately dissolve the strategic habits it creates, because the reflex to demonstrate resolve through force persisted even when the geopolitical context had shifted. And this persistence helps explain why the late Cold War remained punctuated by sudden, limited clashes that carried disproportionate symbolic weight, as states struggled to reconcile the desire for stability with the fear of appearing weak. And in this sense, the incident occupies a revealing place in Cold War history, not as a turning point that altered global alignment, but as a diagnostic moment that exposed the continuity of Cold War thinking beyond Vietnam, showing how easily uncertainty could be transformed into violence when credibility was perceived to be at stake. And as the episode receded into memory, it left behind a sobering lesson that the Cold War's most enduring danger lay not only in its grand confrontations, but in the smaller crises where urgency, symbolism, and incomplete information converged, producing outcomes whose costs were borne immediately while their meaning remained contested long after the fighting ended. As the Cold War entered its later phase, the Mayagüez incident increasingly came to be understood as a warning rather than a vindication, because it demonstrated how quickly the pursuit of symbolic restoration could override proportional judgment, revealing a continuity of mindset that bridged the defeat in Vietnam and the interventions that would follow in later decades. And this continuity mattered because it showed that credibility, once elevated to a core strategic value, could drive action even when material interests were limited and intelligence incomplete. And for the United States, the incident exposed the lingering vulnerability of a superpower struggling to redefine itself after a traumatic loss, as policymakers interpreted challenge through the prism of humiliation rather than through detached assessment, leading to decisions that prioritized speed and visibility over restraint. And within military circles, the episode reinforced the growing recognition that modern operations required not only force, but integration, coordination, and reliable intelligence. Lessons that would gradually reshape doctrine, but could not erase the underlying impulse to act decisively under pressure. And politically, the Mayagüez incident served as an early test of post-Vietnam civil-military relations, highlighting how quickly executive authority could mobilize force in the absence of clear congressional consensus, a dynamic that suggested the institutional balance sought after Vietnam remained fragile and contested, And internationally, the incident underscored how revolutionary regimes and non-aligned states interpreted American behavior through their own strategic lenses, seeing both the willingness to escalate and the susceptibility to misjudgment, a combination that invited caution rather than submission. And for Cambodia, the episode reinforced a narrative of hostility that deepened its isolation and hardened its revolutionary stance, even as it confirmed the prudence of avoiding sustained confrontation with a distant yet unpredictable power. And, from a broader historical perspective, the Mayagüez Incident illustrates how the Cold War's logic persisted even as its geopolitical terrain shifted, because the patterns of rapid escalation, symbolic signaling, and risk acceptance remained embedded in decision-making structures, ready to be activated by crises that resonated emotionally even if they lacked strategic depth. And this persistence explains why the late Cold War was marked not by a smooth transition to restraint, but by a series of sharp, localized confrontations that carried echoes of earlier conflicts. And in this sense, the incident stands as a bridge between eras, revealing how the habits forged during prolonged ideological rivalry could survive its most devastating setbacks, shaping responses long after the original rationale had weakened. And as historians continue to evaluate the Mayagüez incident, it remains a potent example of how easily uncertainty can be converted into violence when credibility is perceived to be at risk, reminding us that the Cold War's dangers were not confined to its largest crises, but were equally present in moments when the urge to demonstrate resolve collided with incomplete information, producing outcomes whose human costs were immediate and whose strategic meaning remains debated. As the years passed and the Cold War's final decades unfolded, the Mayagüez incident came to be remembered less for its immediate tactical details and more for what it revealed about the psychological state of American power in the mid-1970s. Because the operation exposed a superpower caught between the desire to close a painful chapter and the inability to abandon the reflexes that chapter had created. And this tension mattered because it showed how credibility, once framed as fragile, could become a self-imposed trap, compelling action even when restraint might better serve long-term stability. And for the United States, the incident underscored how the trauma of Vietnam had not produced clarity so much as hypersensitivity, making leaders acutely responsive to challenges that appeared to threaten national prestige. And this hypersensitivity narrowed the margin for error, encouraging rapid escalation in situations where patience or negotiation might have sufficed. And within the military, the episode reinforced ongoing debates about joint command, intelligence integration, and the risks of improvised operations, debates that acknowledged technical failures while often leaving untouched the deeper assumption that decisive force was the primary currency of resolve. And politically, the incident highlighted the unresolved struggle between executive initiative and legislative oversight, demonstrating how quickly crisis could override caution and how easily authority could be centralized in moments framed as emergencies, even after a long war had exposed the costs of such concentration. And internationally, the Mayagüez incident contributed to a recalibration of expectations because it suggested that American restraint was conditional and that sudden escalation remained possible when symbolic lines were crossed, a perception that encouraged both caution and opportunism among other states. And for Cambodia, the episode confirmed its isolation from the international system, reinforcing the Khmer Rouge's inward turn and their conviction that foreign powers were inherently hostile, even as it validated their decision to disengage once confrontation threatened to expand beyond their control. And from a broader Cold War perspective, the incident illustrates how the era's logic persisted beyond formal turning points, because the Habits of deterrence, signaling, and risk acceptance remained active even after the United States had withdrawn from its longest war, shaping responses to crises in ways that reproduced familiar patterns of miscalculation and cost. And in this sense, the Mayagüez incident stands as a quiet but telling episode, revealing that the Cold War's most enduring legacy was not simply ideological rivalry, but a mode of decision-making that privileged speed and symbolism over deliberation. And as historians continue to examine the incident, it serves as a reminder that the end of one conflict does not automatically dissolve the strategic instincts it creates, and that the pursuit of restored credibility, when detached from clear objectives, can transform limited disputes into lethal confrontations whose consequences linger long after the original provocation has faded. In closing, the Mayagüez incident stands as one of the Cold War's most revealing postscript crises, because it demonstrated how deeply the habits of escalation, credibility politics, and symbolic force had embedded themselves in American decision-making, even after the formal end of the Vietnam War. And what makes the episode so significant is not its scale, but its timing, occurring at a moment when the United States was attempting to redefine itself after defeat, yet responding to uncertainty with instincts forged during years of prolonged conflict. And this response revealed a superpower still governed by the fear that inaction would invite further challenge, a fear powerful enough to override caution, intelligence gaps, and proportionality. And while the safe return of the Mayagüez crew allowed the operation to be framed publicly as a success, the deaths suffered on Koh Tang exposed the cost of acting under pressure without clarity, illustrating how credibility-driven logic can sustain violence even after the original political objective has already been met. And this disconnect between symbolic victory and human loss underscores a central paradox of the Cold War, that the pursuit of strength often produced outcomes that were strategically ambiguous, yet immediately lethal. And from a broader historical perspective, the incident reveals how the Cold War did not end cleanly with treaties or withdrawals, but lingered in the form of reflexes, assumptions, and fears that continued to shape behavior, turning limited provocations into tests of national resolve. And in this sense, the Mayagüez incident serves as a cautionary epilogue to Vietnam and a bridge into the late Cold War, showing how easily uncertainty could still be transformed into force when credibility was perceived to be at stake, and reminding us that the Cold War's most enduring danger lay not only in its grand confrontations, but in the smaller crises where speed, symbolism, and incomplete information converged, producing decisions whose consequences were immediate, irreversible, and borne by those sent to fight before the political meaning of the moment was fully understood.